7 billion Guyanese dollars. That is what the government has already committed to a single building. Not a hospital, not 100 schools. One terminal rising out of the Amazon floodplain on a runway that did not exist 5 years ago. And here is the number that should stop you. The last time this country tried to expand this same airport, inspectors found 1,500 defects in the work that had already been paid for. Cracked concrete, wiring that did not meet code, money that had already left the treasury and bought almost nothing. So ask yourself the question the government is not asking out loud. If Guyana could not get a runway extension right the first time, what happens when the stakes are 10 times higher? The money is oil money, and the whole world is watching to see if this small nation can actually pull off one of the boldest infrastructure bets in the hemisphere. This is the story of Guyana's mega airport, not the version you have seen in the glossy renderings, with glass walls and rainforest gardens and a president promising a new Singapore in South America. This is the version underneath that story. Because behind the marble and the marketing, there is a fight happening right now over who this airport is actually for, whether the country can manage a project this size without repeating its own history, and whether an oil boom that is supposed to change everything might quietly leave most Guyanese exactly where they started. If you are Guyanese and living in New York, Toronto, or London, this is not a story about a building far away. This is a story about whether the money coming out of the ground under your home country ever finds its way back to the people who never left. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly what is being gambled. Who stands to win and who could be left holding the bill? Before we go further, I want to ask you to do one thing. If stories like this matter to you, stories that go past the headlines and into the real stakes for the Caribbean and its diaspora, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. We are a small, independent operation built by people who care about getting this region's story right, and we are working toward our first 10,000 subscribers so we can keep making documentaries like this one without compromise. It costs you nothing and it means everything to a channel like ours. Now, let's get into it. To understand why a single airport terminal has become the most consequential infrastructure project in Guyana's history, you need to understand what Guyana actually was before any of this started. Because this country's story is one of the strangest paradoxes in the Western Hemisphere. Guyana sits on the northern shoulder of South America, wedged between Venezuela and Suriname, roughly the size of the United Kingdom. And for most of its modern history, it was treated, even by its own region, as an afterthought. Not quite Caribbean, not quite South American, floating in a kind of geographic no-man's land that made it easy for the rest of the world to overlook. And yet this was never a poor country in the way the word usually gets used. Guyana has always been extraordinarily rich in natural resources: gold, bauxite, diamonds, timber. Some of the last untouched rainforest left on the entire planet, covering more than 80% of the national territory. This is a country that, on paper, should have been wealthy 100 years ago. But wealth buried in the ground or hidden under jungle canopy does nothing for the people living on top of it unless you can move it, sell it, and connect it to the rest of the world. And that was Guyana's real curse. Not poverty of resources, but poverty of access. For decades, the interior of the country was almost a separate world. Indigenous communities in the deep interior could only be reached by small aircraft or by days-long river journeys. There were no highways cutting through the jungle, no rail lines, none of the infrastructure that lets a resource-rich nation actually capitalize on what it has. The wealth was real. The roads to reach it simply were not. And nowhere was this isolation more visible than at the country's front door, Changi International Airport, sitting about 41 kilometers south of the capital, Georgetown. For years, this airport was less a gateway and more a punchline. Travelers described it as cramped, dated, and slow. It technically worked. It got planes on the ground. But it did nothing to suggest that Guyana was a country going anywhere. The core problem was physical. The main runway was too short to let large, long-haul aircraft like the Boeing 747 take off fully loaded. That single limitation had enormous consequences. It meant there were essentially no direct flights from major hubs in Europe or Asia, and very few from North America. If you wanted to fly to Guyana from London or Toronto, you were almost certainly connecting through another Caribbean island first, adding hours and expense to every single trip. Multiply that inconvenience across every tourist, every investor, every returning member of the diaspora trying to visit family, and you start to see how one short runway quietly strangled an entire economy's potential. While Barbados and Trinidad poured money into modernizing their airports and turning them into regional hubs, Guyana's gateway stayed frozen in time, a physical symbol of a nation that the rest of the world had, quite literally decided was not worth a direct flight. It is worth sitting with just how total that isolation was, because it explains why what happened next felt less like an upgrade and more like a rupture in the country's entire trajectory. Guyana spent the better part of 2 centuries as a colonial and post-colonial afterthought, first under Dutch control, then British, gaining independence only in 1966, and inheriting an economy built almost entirely around sugar, rice, and bauxite exports that enriched a small elite while leaving the broader population in a cycle of underdevelopment that outlasted colonialism itself. By the early 2000s, per capita income in Guyana lagged behind almost every other country in South America, and emigration became, for an entire generation, the default plan rather than the exception. Hundreds of thousands of Guyanese left for New York, Toronto, and London. Not because they wanted to, but because the countries simply could not generate enough opportunity to keep them. That is the demographic reality behind why the Guyanese diaspora is, in relative terms, one of the largest in the world compared to the population that remained behind. More people born in Guyana live outside the country today than the number who live inside it. Understand that fact, and you understand why this airport story cannot be told honestly without constantly returning to the diaspora, because the diaspora is not a side audience for this story. It is arguably the primary audience the entire hub strategy is quietly built around. Then, in 2015, everything changed in a single moment. An offshore drilling rig, working deep beneath the Atlantic in a stretch of water known as the Stabroek Block, roughly 190 kilometers off Guyana's coast, struck oil. And it was not a modest find. It turned out to be one of the largest offshore oil discoveries anywhere in the world in the past several decades, eventually assessed at more than 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil equivalent across dozens of individual discoveries within the same block. Within a few years, ExxonMobil, Hess, and the Chinese state-owned CNOOC were operating a joint venture producing hundreds of thousands of barrels a day, a figure that has continued climbing as additional production vessels have come online. By early 2026, production from the Stabroek Block was pushing past 650,000 barrels a day, positioning Guyana on a per capita basis as the largest oil producer on the planet. Not the largest in the Caribbean or in South America, the largest anywhere once you divide national output by population size. For context, this is a country with a population smaller than many mid-sized cities, fewer than 1 million people, suddenly sitting on one of the richest oil discoveries on the planet, extracted and sold by companies with no historical connection to the country beyond the contracts signed to develop it. The economic numbers that followed are almost impossible to process normally. Guyana's GDP growth became the fastest in the entire world, not for 1 year, but repeatedly, year after year, as oil production ramped up. Government projections suggested that between 2025 and 2028 alone, the state could collect more than $12 billion in oil revenue. For a country whose entire annual budget, just over a decade earlier, was a small fraction of that figure, this was not incremental growth. This was a complete national reset. This new money was funneled into a sovereign wealth fund, the Natural Resource Fund, structured, at least on paper, to prevent the classic resource curse, a sudden windfall that gets spent on short-term political giveaways instead of long-term national capacity. The fund operates under a formula that is supposed to withdraw a controlled, sustainable amount each year for the national budget, while the remainder accumulates for future generations, modeled loosely on the approach Norway took with its own oil wealth decades earlier. On paper, this is one of the more disciplined resource fund structures adopted by any newly oil-rich nation. In practice, opposition politicians and independent economists inside Guyana have repeatedly raised concerns that withdrawal limits have already been revised upward more than once since the fund's creation, and that parliamentary oversight of how the money actually gets spent remains thin. This is not a uniquely Guyanese failure. Nearly every resource fund in history has faced the same political pressure to spend faster than originally planned, but it is a pattern worth watching rather than assuming away. The stated plan was to use the fund for exactly the kind of infrastructure that had been missing for generations. a new bridge across the Demerara River, replacing a decades-old pontoon crossing that had become a daily bottleneck for the entire east-west corridor of the country. Gas-to-energy projects intended to cut electricity costs roughly in half, addressing a cost-of-living pressure that has hit ordinary households far harder than any headline GDP figure suggests. Upgrades to roads, schools, hospitals, the unglamorous infrastructure that rarely makes it into an international headline, but is what daily life in a developing economy is actually made of. And sitting right at the center of that national strategy, treated by the government not as one project among many but as the flagship, was the transformation of Chetty Jagan International Airport. The thinking here is not complicated, and it is worth taking seriously, because it is not wrong. Oil revenue is finite. It will run out, or at least taper off within decades. If none of that windfall gets converted into something that keeps generating income after the oil stops flowing, the country will have burned through a historic opportunity and have nothing durable to show for it. An airport done properly is exactly the kind of asset that can outlive an oil boom. It attracts investment, it attracts tourism, it attracts the kind of business travel that builds an economy beyond extraction. President Irfan Ali has been explicit that this project is meant to be the engine that carries Guyana's economy forward, long after the last barrel of Stabroek crude has been pumped and sold. In August of 2025, President Ali stood at the airport site for a groundbreaking ceremony that made the scale of this ambition unmistakable. A new terminal, 150,000 square feet, being constructed by BHM Construction with design guidance from the United Kingdom's Manchester Airport Group. 7 billion Guyanese dollars, roughly 33 million US dollars, already committed from the 2025 national budget just to get the project moving. This is not a modest renovation. This is a declaration. And the concept behind the design is genuinely striking. The stated goal is to fuse extreme luxury with the raw, wild identity of the Amazon itself. Not a sterile, forgettable airport terminal that could be anywhere in the world, but something that announces, from the moment you step off the plane, that you have arrived somewhere unlike anywhere else on Earth. President Ali has described it in almost sensory terms. Travelers won't just walk through an airport. They will see the Amazon, feel it, hear it, before they've even collected their luggage. The reference point being used internally is Singapore's Changi Airport, a terminal so distinctive that it became a destination unto itself rather than simply a place people pass through. Let's walk through exactly what is being built, because the specifics matter here. Start with the runway, because everything else depends on it. The main runway has been extended to 3,360 meters, just over 11,000 feet. That extension reclassifies the airport as Category Code E, which is aviation terminology for a runway capable of handling the largest wide-body jets in commercial service, aircraft like the Boeing 747-400 used on long-haul international routes. This single technical upgrade is the foundation the entire hub strategy rests on. It is why British Airways, which began flying to Guyana directly in 2023, can operate that route at all. It is why future direct connections to Asia, Africa, and the rest of the Americas become physically possible for the first time in the airport's history. Without this runway, none of the rest of the vision, the luxury terminal, the hotel district, the hub ambitions, has anywhere to stand. Next, the terminal itself, which is where the government's storytelling ambitions really come through. The new building, which will handle all arriving passengers once complete, is designed around enormous glass walls that flood the space with natural light and blur the boundary between the terminal and the rainforest surrounding it. Indoor gardens, artwork built around Guyana's biodiversity and culture, a deliberate rejection of the sterile, interchangeable airport aesthetic you find in most of the world. But this is not being sold as luxury instead of authenticity, it is being sold as both at once. The terminal will include business lounges, expanded duty-free retail, and a broader mix of restaurants and shops than the current facility could ever support. Once the new building opens for arrivals, the existing terminal will be repurposed exclusively for departures, which on its own should meaningfully ease the congestion that has become common as passenger numbers have surged. And that surge has been dramatic. Annual passenger traffic climbed from around 182,000 in 2020 to more than 850,000 by 2024, with projections now pointing toward 1 million passengers a year in the near future. The new terminal is being sized specifically to absorb that growth rather than be overwhelmed by it the way the old one was. Then there is the wider ecosystem being built around the airport itself, because the government has been explicit that a runway and a terminal alone do not make a hub. Just a few minutes' drive from the airport, a $20 million courtyard by Marriott has already been commissioned. A 150-room property built specifically for airline crews, business travelers, and passengers making connections. This is Guyana's first international airport hotel, and its purpose is narrow and deliberate. Keep the economic activity generated by increased air traffic inside the country, rather than watching travelers and their spending disappear onto the next leg of their journey. Alongside the hotel, a new commercial center is planned, with retail and office space designed to create a genuinely self-sustaining economic zone around the airport, rather than an isolated terminal sitting alone at the edge of the jungle. President Ali summarized the logic behind all of it directly. If the ambition is to become a real aviation hub, you need more than planes and a runway. You need the surrounding infrastructure that makes people want to stop, stay, and spend. Runway, terminal, hotel, commercial district. 4 pieces of a single, coordinated bet. Now here is where the story gets more interesting, because building something is only half the equation. The other half is what that project is actually supposed to achieve for a country. And here the government's ambitions extend into 3 distinct arenas: the economy, tourism, and Guyana's standing in the region. Start with the economic argument, because this is the one that matters most for the country's long-term stability. Guyana's leadership is aware, at least in its public messaging, of the classic trap that swallows so many resource-rich nations: enormous windfall wealth concentrated in a single extractive industry, with almost nothing built to diversify the economy before that windfall inevitably declines. The airport is positioned as the primary tool for avoiding that trap. Since 2020, 11 new airlines have begun flying into Guyana, including major carriers like British Airways and United. Each new route is not just a convenience, it is a new channel for trade, for cargo capacity, for the kind of business travel that lets international companies actually operate in the Guyanese energy sector without treating the country as an inconvenient afterthought to reach. Cargo capacity in particular matters more than most people realize, because Guyana's agricultural sector, rice, timber, seafood, and increasingly niche exports aimed at diaspora markets abroad, has historically been constrained not by production capacity but by the physical difficulty of getting perishable or time-sensitive goods onto international markets quickly. More belly cargo space on more frequent flights is a direct practical lever for exporters who previously had almost no viable air freight option out of the country at all. President Ali has also floated the idea of a major regional aviation training academy, positioning Guyana as a hub not just for flights, but for the people who keep an aviation industry running. Pilots, technicians, ground crews, air traffic controllers, trained locally and, ideally, exported regionally to other Caribbean and South American nations facing their own aviation labor shortages. This is a genuinely underappreciated part of the strategy, because global aviation has been dealing with a persistent shortage of trained pilots and technicians for years, a shortage that predates and will likely outlast the current oil boom. If Guyana can position itself as a training pipeline for that shortage, it creates a category of skilled exportable labor that has nothing to do with oil prices, sitting entirely outside the extractive economy the country is trying to diversify away from. That is precisely the kind of durable, oil-independent industry a resource fund is supposed to help seed. Whether the academy actually gets built at the scale being discussed, with accreditation that international carriers and regulators actually respect, remains to be seen, but the logic behind the idea is sound even if the execution, like everything else in this story, is not guaranteed. Beyond aviation specifically, the broader case for treating the airport as an economic multiplier rather than an isolated expense rests on a fairly simple principle that has held true in dozens of countries. Connectivity compounds. A country that is hard to reach struggles to attract the kind of foreign direct investment that requires executives and technical staff to visit regularly, struggles to convince international conference organizers or trade bodies to host events there, and struggles to convince skilled members of its own diaspora that returning home, even part-time, is practical. Each of those frictions individually seems minor, Together, over a decade, they add up to a country that stays isolated regardless of how much wealth sits under its ocean floor. The bet Guyana is making is that solving the connectivity problem unlocks all of these smaller, harder-to-quantify benefits simultaneously, rather than needing a dozen separate, disconnected investments to achieve the same result. Second, tourism, and this is arguably where Guyana's potential has been most dramatically underused for the longest time. This is a country home to Kaieteur Falls, one of the most powerful single-drop waterfalls anywhere on the planet, alongside rainforest ecosystems that ecotourists spend years dreaming about visiting. And for decades, almost none of that potential converted into an actual tourism economy, because getting to Guyana was simply too difficult and too expensive for the average traveler. A runway capable of direct long-haul flights changes that equation immediately. Even a fraction of the government's most optimistic tourism growth targets would represent an unprecedented boom for hotels, tour operators, and the small, often family-run craft and hospitality businesses that tend to benefit most directly when tourism actually reaches beyond a capital city and into a country's interior. And the terminal's design itself functions as a marketing tool before a visitor has even left the airport. A deliberate first impression meant to rebrand Guyana in the traveler's mind from a remote, hard-to-reach outpost into a premium, sophisticated destination worth the trip. Third, and arguably the boldest ambition of all, is the geopolitical one. President Ali has asked, publicly and pointedly, why should Miami get to be a hub and not Guyana? That is not a rhetorical throwaway line. It is a direct challenge to the existing order of regional aviation, an order that has been dominated for decades by Panama City, Port of Spain in Trinidad, and Bridgetown in Barbados. Guyana's geography actually supports the ambition more than people give it credit for. It sits at a genuine crossroads between the Caribbean and South America, with growing connections to North America and increasingly to Africa. The government's vision is for Chedi Jagan International Airport to become a legitimate transit point, moving people and cargo between continents rather than simply serving as a final destination. To support that ambition, the government has also been tightening security protocols to enable smoother, faster transit for passengers connecting onward to the United States and elsewhere, the kind of behind-the-scenes work that airlines actually evaluate before committing new routes. This is Guyana attempting to convert a geographic weakness, decades of isolation, into a geographic strength, a natural bridge point between three continents. It is an audacious idea, and audacious ideas in infrastructure come with audacious risk. There is also a wider geopolitical current running underneath this project that rarely gets discussed openly in the government's own messaging, but that regional analysts watch closely. Guyana's oil wealth and its strategic Atlantic coastline have made it a genuine point of interest for both the United States and China simultaneously, each courting Georgetown for different reasons. American energy companies dominate the offshore oil production itself, and Washington has steadily deepened security and diplomatic ties with Guyana, partly as a counterweight to Venezuela, which has an active, unresolved territorial claim over roughly two-thirds of Guyana's landmass. The long-running Essequibo dispute that flared up again in recent years as Venezuela's own economic crisis pushed its government toward more aggressive rhetoric over the border. China, meanwhile, holds a significant stake in the offshore oil consortium through CNOOC, and Chinese state-linked construction and infrastructure firms have been active bidders across the wider Caribbean and South American infrastructure boom that Guyana's own projects are part of. An airport capable of handling long-haul international traffic. Sitting on a coastline the United States has explicit strategic interest in protecting from Venezuelan pressure is not purely a tourism and trade play. It is also, whether Guyanese officials frame it this way publicly or not, a piece of infrastructure that reinforces the country's international visibility and its relationships with major powers who have their own reasons for wanting Guyana to succeed, or at minimum, for wanting Guyana to remain stable and Western-aligned rather than vulnerable to regional pressure. None of this changes the practical realities of runway length or terminal capacity, but it does help explain why a small nation with fewer than 1 million people has been able to attract this level of international construction expertise, diplomatic attention, and financing confidence in such a short window of time. Guyana is not building this airport in isolation. It is building it inside a live regional contest for influence. And that context shapes everything from which construction firms get contracts to how quickly security and custom protocols get modernized to meet international transit standards. This is where we need to slow down, because this is the part of the story that gets left out of almost every glossy segment covering this project. The vision is genuinely compelling, but visions do not build airports, execution does. And Guyana's execution history on this exact project is not reassuring. Before we get to Guyana's specific numbers, it is worth briefly looking at what has happened to other small nations that discovered enormous oil wealth almost overnight, because the pattern is disturbingly consistent. And it is the pattern Guyana is explicitly trying to avoid. Trinidad and Tobago built a genuinely prosperous energy economy off natural gas and oil across the 20th century, and yet decades later still struggles with an economy that remains heavily dependent on hydrocarbons, with diversification efforts that never fully materialized despite constant political promises that they would. Venezuela, sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, descended from one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America in the 1970s into economic collapse and mass emigration by the 2010s, undone by a toxic mix of mismanagement, corruption, and an economy so dependent on oil that it had no shock absorber left when oil prices fell and political institutions failed. Nigeria discovered oil in the 1950s and, despite trillions of dollars in cumulative oil revenue since, still has tens of millions of citizens living in poverty, a pattern economists have studied so extensively it has its own name, the resource curse, or sometimes the paradox of plenty. The observation that countries rich in natural resources often grow more slowly and develop less equitably than countries without them, precisely because resource wealth concentrates power, invites corruption, and lets governments avoid building the broader institutions that oil-poor countries are forced to build in order to survive. Guyana's government is aware of this history, and to its credit, has referenced Norway rather than Venezuela or Nigeria as its intended model, a country that used its own 1970s oil discovery to build the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, while maintaining strong democratic institutions and broad-based prosperity. But intention is not outcome, and every failed resource economy in history also began with officials pointing to Norway and insisting their country would be different. The airport project sits precisely at the fork in that road. It is either the first proof point that Guyana is actually building Norway-style durable infrastructure, or it is the first expensive symbol of a familiar pattern repeating itself with a new country's name attached. Rewind to the previous attempt at expanding this same airport before the current government took office in 2020. That earlier expansion became something close to a national embarrassment, plagued by years of delay, substandard construction, and budgets that spiraled far beyond what had been approved. When the incoming administration inspected the work that had already been paid for, they documented more than 1,500 individual defects, cracked structural elements, electrical work that did not meet basic safety standards, money that had already left the treasury and produced almost nothing usable. That is not ancient history. That is the direct institutional memory this current, far larger project is being built on top of. And the uncomfortable truth about mega-projects, one that holds true almost everywhere in the world, not just in Guyana, is that they tend to run over budget and over schedule far more often than they come in on time and on target. Research into large infrastructure projects globally, spanning decades in dozens of countries, has repeatedly found that roughly 9 out of 10 megaprojects exceed their original budget, often by margins of 50% or more. And airport terminals specifically are among the most frequent offenders because they combine complex specialized construction with the kind of prestige, political pressure that discourages anyone from admitting a project is behind schedule until it is undeniable. The $7 billion Guyanese commitment announced so far, worth roughly $33 million US, is explicitly described by the government itself as a down payment, not a final figure, and industry estimates for a terminal and runway project of this scale, once the hotel, commercial center, and associated infrastructure are included, run considerably higher, into the hundreds of millions of US dollars once every phase is complete. Some analysts and observers are openly questioning whether Guyana, even flush with unprecedented oil wealth, is taking on more complexity and financial exposure than its relatively young institutions, including a construction sector that has historically struggled with exactly this kind of large-scale project, can comfortably absorb. An oil wealth, it is worth remembering, is not guaranteed forever. A sustained drop in global oil prices, a shift in global energy demand as the world's transition toward renewables accelerates, or a broader economic shock could squeeze the national budget at precisely the moment an over-budget airport needs more money to finish, not less. Guyana's entire multi-decade plan is, in effect, a bet that oil prices and global demand remain favorable long enough for this diversification strategy to actually take hold before the window closes. Then there is the environmental question, and this one cuts especially deep, because Guyana's entire national identity, and increasingly its tourism strategy, is built around being one of the last places on Earth with vast stretches of untouched rainforest. A megaproject of this scale inevitably brings land clearing, urbanization, and construction activity that puts real pressure on that identity. The terminal's design leans heavily into celebrating biodiversity and natural beauty. But there is an obvious tension between building something that markets itself as being in harmony with nature and the physical reality of large-scale construction and the increased air and ground traffic that follows a major hub. Environmental groups and independent observers will be watching closely to see whether the government's language about biodiversity is matched by genuine, verifiable environmental practice, or whether it ends up functioning mainly as marketing. If it turns out to be the latter, the damage would not stay contained to the local ecosystem. It would undercut the entire eco-luxury brand the project depends on to justify itself internationally. Then there is the competition, and this is where Guyana's ambition runs directly into decades of entrenched advantage held by other regional hubs. Panama's Tocumen International Airport is the home base of Copa Airlines, a carrier that has spent decades methodically building a network, connecting more than 80 destinations across the hemisphere, moving well over 16 million passengers a year through a hub built specifically around efficient, fast connections. Trinidad's Piarco International has held a similar regional anchor position for the Eastern Caribbean for generations, and Barbados has spent years cultivating its own role as a stopover point between North America, Europe, and the smaller Eastern Caribbean islands. That is not a head start Guyana can close with a newer building and a longer runway alone. Airlines do not shift established routes casually, because route networks are built around passenger demand that already exists, and demand tends to follow existing hub infrastructure, not the other way around. Every new route a carrier adds represents years of forecasting, aircraft allocation, and crew scheduling built around an assumption that passenger volume will justify the investment. This creates a genuinely difficult chicken and egg problem that economists who study aviation networks refer to constantly. You need transit passengers to justify being a hub, but you generally need to already be a hub with an established network of connections to attract those transit passengers in the first place. Panama solved this problem decades ago and has been defending its position ever since. Guyana is trying to solve it from a standing start with oil money as its primary lever rather than decades of accumulated route history. If this bet does not pay off, Guyana risks ending up with an extraordinary, beautifully designed, and extremely expensive airport that services its own growing population and its diaspora reasonably well, but never achieves the broader transit hub status the government is explicitly chasing, the scenario where CJIA becomes a very good national airport rather than the regional hub it was built to be. That would not be a total failure by any means. A modern, efficient national airport is itself a major upgrade from what existed before. But it would fall well short of the geopolitical ambition driving the scale of investment, and it would leave open the question of whether that gap between the money spent and the hub status achieved was worth the bet. And finally, there is the risk that matters most if you are watching this from the diaspora, rather than from a government press conference. The risk that this entire transformation ends up benefiting a narrow slice of Guyanese society, while leaving most ordinary citizens essentially where they started. Oil booms, almost universally, bring inflation and a rising cost of living even as headline GDP numbers look spectacular on paper. Rents in Georgetown have already climbed sharply since the oil boom began, driven partly by an influx of foreign oil workers, contractors, and executives with far higher disposable incomes than the average Guyanese salary can compete with. Basic goods, construction materials, and housing costs have followed a similar trajectory. This is a well-documented pattern in oil boom economies, sometimes called Dutch disease among economists, where the sudden inflow of foreign currency and foreign workers drives up local prices faster than local wages can rise to meet them, effectively making ordinary citizens poorer in real terms, even as the country as a whole gets dramatically richer on paper. Independent estimates have suggested that a substantial share of Guyana's population, more than half by some measures, still lives below the poverty line even as the country posts the fastest GDP growth figures in the world, a gap that should give anyone pause before accepting the airport's marketing at face value. If this glittering new airport becomes a symbol of a wealthier, more connected Guyana that most Guyanese people cannot actually access or afford to participate in, tourists flying business class into a luxury terminal while local communities in the interior remain reachable only by small aircraft or multi-day river journeys exactly as they were a decade ago, then the project will have failed its most important promise, regardless of how impressive the architecture turns out to be. An airport that connects Georgetown to London and New York, while doing nothing to connect Guyana's own interior to its own capital, is not the kind of connection this country actually needs most. This is the tension sitting at the center of everything. A country trying to leap, in the span of roughly a decade, from being one of South America's most overlooked and isolated nations to becoming a genuine aviation and economic hub for the Western Hemisphere. The ambition is real, and in many respects it is justified by genuine geographic and economic logic. But the execution risk is equally real, and it is not theoretical, it is documented, sitting in an inspection report listing 1,500 defects from the last time this exact airport tried something like this. So where does that leave things, practically, for the people this matters most to? If you are Guyanese and living abroad in Brooklyn, in Scarborough, in South London, this project is not an abstraction. It is directly tied to how easily you can get home to see family, to whether the businesses your relatives run back home get access to new trade routes and new customers, to whether the cost of living in Georgetown climbs faster than local wages can keep pace with, and to whether the oil wealth transforming your home country's global reputation ever actually reaches the neighborhoods and villages where your family still lives. Think about the practical shift already underway. A direct flight from London used to mean routing through Barbados or Trinidad first, adding hours and often a full extra day to a journey home. A direct flight from Toronto or New York meant similar detours or premium pricing for the rare non-stop option. As more carriers add direct routes into Georgetown, that friction starts to disappear, and for a diaspora this large, spread across 3 major countries and multiple generations, cheaper, faster, more frequent access to Guyana is not a minor convenience. It is the difference between visiting home every few years and visiting every year. It is the difference between sending remittances through informal channels and being able to physically carry investment, equipment, or support directly to family and to local businesses. Every diaspora community that has watched its home country's main airport improve has seen this same ripple effect, and there is real reason to believe Guyana's diaspora, given its sheer size relative to the resident population, could accelerate the country's development specifically because that connection gets easier. But that same connection cuts both ways. A more accessible Guyana also means faster, easier access for the foreign contractors, oil executives, and speculative investors whose presence is already driving up costs in Georgetown. The same runway that makes it easier for you to visit your grandmother also makes it easier for international capital to move in and out of the country with less friction than ever before. And international capital does not automatically prioritize the interests of the people who were already living there. The honest answer right now is that nobody can tell you with certainty how this ends. The runway extension is real and already operational, and that alone has already begun reshaping which airlines are willing to fly direct into Georgetown. The terminal is under active construction with a serious international construction partner and a genuinely ambitious design brief. The hotel is built and open. These are not vaporware promises, they are physical facts on the ground. But the larger questions, whether the budget holds, whether construction quality matches the last decade's failures or breaks from them, whether the hub strategy actually pulls transit traffic away from Panama and Trinidad and Barbados, and whether ordinary Guyanese see real, tangible benefit rather than watching from outside a terminal built mostly for international business travelers. None of those questions have answers yet. They will be answered over the next several years by the choices this government and the ones that follow it make, and by whether independent oversight, journalism, and public pressure force transparency where it has historically been missing. Guyana has undeniably stopped waiting for opportunity to arrive and started building it directly, with its own money, on its own terms. That in itself marks a genuine shift from decades of being talked about as a country full of untapped potential and nothing else. Whether this specific $50 billion bet, when you account for the airport, the hotel, the commercial district, and everything tied to it, becomes the foundation of a genuinely diversified, resilient economy, or becomes a cautionary tale about ambition outrunning institutional capacity, is still being written in real time. Here is what I want to ask you directly, because this is the question that actually matters, and it rarely gets asked honestly. If you have family in Guyana, or if you have watched this country's transformation from wherever you are in the diaspora, do you believe this oil wealth is being managed in a way that will genuinely reach ordinary Guyanese people? Or do you see the early signs of a wealth gap that gets wider even as the country's international reputation gets shinier? I want to hear a real answer in the comments, not just excitement about the renderings. Tell me what you are seeing, whether that is optimism from families still living there, or skepticism based on how the last major project actually turned out. If this kind of reporting, the kind that shows you both the ambition and the risk without picking a side for you, is something you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps us keep doing this work independently. We are building toward 10,000 subscribers so we can keep telling these stories about the Caribbean and its diaspora with the depth they deserve, without chasing hype for its own sake. Guyana's mega airport is not simply a story about concrete and steel and a longer runway. It is a story about whether a nation that spent generations locked out of its own potential can convert a historic windfall into something that actually lasts, something that survives long after the oil eventually runs dry. The world is watching this bet unfold in real time. The real question, the one that will not be answered for years yet, is whether history in Guyana repeats itself or whether this time, finally, it does not.